How many Steve Rogers are actually hiding inside the Marvel Cinematic Universe? 1, 2, 3? Or is the answer somehow much more complicated than that? Because when you really stop and look at Steve Rogers across the MCU, something strange begins to happen. We have seen Steve at different ages, in different timelines, wearing different versions of the Captain America suit, and now, with Avengers Doomsday, Marvel appears to be showing us two completely different versions of the same man. One Steve is holding a baby in his arms, living what looks like a peaceful life far away from the battlefield. And another Steve is standing across from Thor with long hair, a beard, and Mjolnir in his hand. At first glance, the obvious explanation is simple. They are the same Steve. One is just older. But then another question immediately appears. If they really are the same Steve Rogers, what happened between those two moments? How did the man who finally walked away from the Avengers, chose a quiet life, and seemingly found the family he had sacrificed everything for suddenly become the long-haired warrior standing beside Thor again? And if they aren't the same Steve, then we're looking at something much bigger. Because that would mean Avengers Doomsday isn't simply bringing Steve Rogers back. It could be bringing back multiple versions of him. And the strange part is, this wouldn't actually be new for the MCU. Marvel has already shown us what happens when two Steve Rogers exist in the same place at the same time. We've already watched Steve Rogers fight Steve Rogers. We've already watched an older Steve meet a younger version of himself, and we've already seen another character literally transform into Steve Rogers. So before we try to figure out how many Steves are coming in Avengers Doomsday, we need to understand how many Steve Rogers we've technically already seen. And that's where this gets much more interesting, because the first thing we have to separate is something that sounds incredibly simple, but changes the entire answer. Steve Rogers is not the same thing as Captain America. Steve Rogers is the person. Captain America is the identity. And once time travel and the multiverse enter the picture, one person can have multiple versions of himself without necessarily becoming multiple completely separate people. That's exactly what happened to Steve. The easiest place to see it is Avengers Endgame. At the beginning of that final battle, we have the Steve Rogers we've followed for years. The same Steve who started as a skinny kid from Brooklyn. The same Steve who became a super soldier. The same Steve who fought through World War II, woke up decades later, joined the Avengers, lost friends, lost Bucky, fought Tony, and eventually stood against Thanos. And then came one of the most iconic moments in the entire MCU. Thanos has nearly defeated everyone. Thor is down. Tony is down. The Avengers are being overwhelmed. Steve is standing alone. And then Mjolnir moves. Steve Rogers catches it. For that one moment, there is no doubt who we're looking at. This is our Steve Rogers, the Steve we've been following since Captain America, the first Avenger. But Endgame then does something that completely changes the rules, because that Steve travels into the past, and eventually, he meets himself. 2012 New York. The Battle of New York has just happened. The younger Avengers are still dealing with the aftermath. And somewhere inside that chaos, the future Steve Rogers comes face to face with the Steve Rogers who hasn't even experienced most of the life that future Steve has already lived. Think about what that actually means. One Steve has already fought Ultron. He's already fought Bucky. He's already fought Tony. He's already survived Civil War. He's already seen Thanos. He's already lost half the universe. And he's already become worthy enough to lift Mjolnir. The other Steve hasn't experienced any of that yet. He's still the 2012 version. Still younger, still carrying the weight of a completely different future he doesn't even know is coming. And then, Captain America fights Captain America. For the first time, Marvel literally puts two Steve Rogers on screen at the same time. But are there two Steve Rogers? Not really. There are two versions of the same Steve at two different points in his life. And that distinction is incredibly important, because if we freeze that exact moment in time, then yes, there are physically two Steve Rogers standing in the same location. But from an identity perspective, we're still dealing with one person. It's the same man, just separated by time. And Endgame does this again at the very end. After the battle is over, Steve takes the Infinity Stones and returns them to their original points in time. At least, that's what we're led to believe he's going to do. The plan seems simple. Go back. Put everything where it belongs. Come back. But Steve makes a decision. Instead of immediately returning to the present, he stays in the past. He chooses Peggy. He chooses the life he was denied. And decades later, that decision brings us to the old man sitting on the bench, elderly Steve Rogers. The shield is gone. The uniform is gone. The war is over. And the man who spent his entire life fighting for everyone else is finally sitting quietly, watching Sam Wilson approach. Now, technically speaking, some people look at that scene and say, we have another Steve Rogers. But again, we don't. It's the same Steve, just older, much older. So if we count every physical version of Steve that can exist simultaneously, Endgame gives us multiple Steves. But if we're counting actual individual Steve Rogers identities, we're still talking about one. And that is where the MCU's relationship with Steve gets really interesting. Because Marvel has already established that a younger Steve and an older Steve can coexist. It is already established that the same Steve can appear at different points in his own timeline. And that means the idea of multiple Steves isn't automatically a multiverse concept. Sometimes it's just time. But then Loki enters the equation. And suddenly, counting Steve Rogers becomes even more complicated because there are moments in the MCU where we see Steve Rogers, but Steve Rogers isn't actually there. Loki has transformed into Captain America before. He has used Steve Rogers' appearance as a disguise. And if we're simply counting every time the audience sees Chris Evans' Captain America face on screen, then technically, Loki's appearance would increase the number. But that would be completely wrong, because Loki isn't Steve Rogers, he's Loki. The face is the same, the identity isn't. And this becomes an important rule for the multiverse saga. Just because two characters look identical doesn't mean they're the same person. And just because the same person appears multiple times doesn't mean we're looking at multiple individuals. Those two ideas sound almost identical, but they're actually completely different. And Marvel has been playing with that distinction for years. The multiverse makes it even more complicated because now you can have two people who genuinely are different individuals but happen to have the same face, the same name, or even the same history up to a certain point. So when we ask, how many Steve Rogers are there? We first have to decide what we're actually counting. Are we counting every physical version? Every timeline, every universe, every disguise, or every completely separate Steve Rogers? Because those numbers would all be different. And that's why my answer, at least based on what the MCU has definitively shown us, is surprisingly simple. There is one confirmed main Steve Rogers, but there are multiple versions of that Steve across time, the younger Steve, the present-day Steve, the elderly Steve, and potentially other versions that we haven't fully identified yet. And that's where Avengers Doomsday changes the entire conversation, because Marvel isn't simply bringing Steve Rogers back. Marvel is specifically showing us different sides of him. In the first official Steve-focused teaser, we see Steve arriving at what appears to be a quiet farmhouse. No battlefield, no Avengers Tower, no shield, no army, just Steve. And then comes the image that immediately changes the emotional context of his return, a baby. Steve Rogers holding a baby in his arms. For a character who spent most of his life fighting, sacrificing, and putting everyone else before himself, this image means something. This isn't Captain America, this is Steve Rogers. And that's important because Marvel itself reportedly emphasizes that distinction by telling us that Steve Rogers will return in Avengers Doomsday. Not simply Captain America. Steve Rogers, the man underneath the symbol. The man who finally got the life he wanted. The man who, after everything he had been through, seemingly chose peace. And for a moment, it feels like Marvel is giving Steve exactly the ending he deserved. Then the trailer changes everything, because suddenly, Steve Rogers is back in the fight, but he doesn't look the same. The hair is longer, the beard is longer, the entire appearance feels different. And then he's standing across from Thor, and in his hand is Mjolnir. That single image creates an entirely different question. Is this the same Steve we just saw holding the baby, or are we looking at another Steve Rogers? Because if they're the same person, something happened, something big enough to pull Steve out of the life he had finally chosen. And if they're not the same person, then Marvel may have just introduced one of the most fascinating possibilities in the entire multiverse saga. Multiple Steve Rogers. Now, the simplest explanation is still that these are the same Steve. And honestly, it makes perfect sense. Steve may have retired from being Captain America, but retiring from the Avengers doesn't mean Steve Rogers stops being Steve Rogers. If the world is facing another catastrophic threat, especially one involving the collapse of realities themselves, it would be completely in character for him to step back into the fight. We've seen this man's entire life built around one fundamental instinct. When people need help, Steve shows up. He can put down the shield. He can walk away from the Avengers. He can choose a quiet life. But when everything he cares about is threatened, the soldier inside him doesn't simply disappear. And that could explain the transformation we're seeing. The peaceful Steve from the teaser could simply be the same man we see later, forced back into a war he thought he had left behind. And the long hair and beard don't necessarily prove anything by themselves. People change. Years pass. Steve could simply have aged. And Mjolnir has an even more obvious explanation. We've already seen him lift it. We've already established that he's worthy. So seeing Steve wield Mjolnir again would be an enormous callback to Endgame. It would remind the audience exactly who this man is, the Steve Rogers who stood against Thanos. The Steve Rogers who proved in one of the biggest moments of his life that being Captain America was never really about the shield. It was about who he was underneath it. But there's another possibility, and this one is far more dangerous. What if the two Steves aren't the same? What if the peaceful Steve holding the baby belongs to one timeline, while the long-haired, bearded Steve belongs to another? Imagine a reality where Steve Rogers never retired, a reality where his life took a completely different path, a reality where the events after Endgame didn't happen the same way, a Steve who never got his peaceful ending, a Steve who kept fighting, and then, as the multiverse begins to collapse, that Steve finds himself in the same reality as another version of himself. One Steve has a family, the other has a battlefield. One Steve chose peace, the other never had the opportunity. One Steve put down the shield, the other never stopped carrying it. And suddenly, the question of how many Steve Rogers exist isn't just a counting exercise anymore. It becomes something much more personal. Because Marvel could use multiple Steve Rogers to show us different versions of the same choice. What happens when Steve chooses love? What happens when he chooses duty? What happens when he gets the life he always wanted? And what happens when he doesn't? And if Avengers Doomsday really is heading toward a collision between universes, then the idea of multiple Steve Rogers standing in the same story becomes more than possible. It becomes almost inevitable, because the MCU has already shown us the blueprint. We've already seen two Steves in the same place. We've already seen different versions of the same man exist simultaneously. We've already seen someone else wear Steve's face. The only thing we haven't seen yet is multiple genuine Steve Rogers variants from different realities meeting each other. And that may be exactly what Marvel is preparing us for. Because there is a huge difference between seeing the same Steve at different points in time and seeing two completely different Steve Rogers who were shaped by completely different realities. And if Avengers Doomsday is playing with that distinction, then the appearance of the long-haired Steve becomes much more important than it first seemed. Because look at what Marvel has chosen to show us. The first Steve is associated with a baby. The second Steve is associated with Mjolnir. Those aren't random visual choices. One image tells us that Steve has finally built a life outside the war. The other reminds us that Steve is still one of the greatest warriors the Avengers have ever had. And that creates a very interesting possibility. Maybe Marvel wants us to believe they're the same Steve at first. Maybe that's the trick. We see Chris Evans, we see Steve Rogers, we see Mjolnir, and our brains immediately connect it to Endgame. Of course it's the same Steve. But what if the reveal comes later? What if the audience eventually discovers that the Steve holding Mjolnir isn't the Steve we've been following? That would completely change the emotional meaning of his return. Because then the question wouldn't simply be, where has Steve been? It would become, where did this Steve come from? And more importantly, what happened to the Steve we already knew? That's where the multiverse can turn a familiar character into something completely new, because a variant doesn't have to be evil. A variant doesn't have to be Kang. A variant doesn't even have to look dramatically different. Sometimes the most interesting variant is the one who looks exactly like the person we know, but made one different choice. And Steve Rogers is arguably the perfect character for that. His entire life has been defined by choices. He chose to sacrifice himself during World War II. He chose to protect Bucky. He chose to stand against the government in Civil War. He chose to fight Thanos. And finally, he chose Peggy. That last choice is especially important, because for almost his entire life, Steve was the person who gave something up. He gave up his health. He gave up his youth. He gave up his chance at a normal life. He lost Bucky. He lost Peggy. He lost almost everyone he knew in the 1940s. And when he finally got a chance to make a choice purely for himself, he chose to go back. That's why the old Steve on the bench matters so much. It's not just a cameo. It's the conclusion of Steve Rogers' emotional journey. The soldier finally stopped fighting. The man who spent decades trying to save everyone else finally allowed himself to live. And that's why the image of Steve holding a baby is so powerful. It's basically the visual representation of the ending he fought for. But now ask yourself something. If that Steve truly got his happy ending, why would Marvel bring him back into another war? Why would a man who had already defeated Thanos, saved the universe, and finally found peace suddenly pick up Mjolnir again? There has to be a reason, and that reason could be as simple as the multiverse being in danger. But there is another possibility. Maybe the Steve holding the baby isn't the same Steve who returns to the battlefield. And if that's true, then Marvel has an opportunity to do something incredibly clever. They could protect Endgame's ending while still bringing Steve Rogers back. Think about it. One of the biggest problems with bringing Steve back after Endgame is that his ending was already complete. He got Peggy. He grew old. He passed the shield to Sam. His story was finished. So if Marvel suddenly says, never mind, Steve is Captain America again, it risks weakening that ending. But if Marvel brings back a different Steve Rogers, then the original Steve can keep his peaceful ending. His story remains intact, and another version of Steve can enter the war. That would allow Marvel to have both things at once: the emotional closure of Endgame and the return of Chris Evans as Steve Rogers. And there is one more thing that makes this possibility especially interesting. The Steve from the teaser doesn't appear to be carrying the identity of Captain America. He isn't presented as the superhero returning to duty. He's presented as Steve. That's why the wording matters. Steve Rogers will return. Not necessarily Captain America. That distinction could be deliberate, because perhaps the character coming back isn't being introduced to replace Sam Wilson. He isn't coming back to reclaim the shield. He isn't returning to become the new Captain America. He is returning as Steve Rogers. And if the long-haired version is a different Steve, then Marvel can have two completely different relationships with the Captain America identity at the same time. Sam Wilson can remain Captain America, the peaceful Steve can remain Steve Rogers, and the alternate Steve can be the one who steps into the battlefield. That would solve a major story problem before it even happens. But then there's Mjolnir. Because if this is a different Steve, why can he lift Mjolnir? And that's where things become even more fascinating. Worthiness isn't supposed to be exclusive to one timeline. If Steve Rogers is fundamentally a good person, an alternate version of him could potentially be worthy too, but that would also tell us something about that variant. Because being worthy of Mjolnir isn't simply about being strong, it's about character, courage, sacrifice. The willingness to do what is right even when there is nothing to gain. So if an alternate Steve Rogers can lift Mjolnir, Marvel could be telling us that, despite everything that changed in his universe, some part of Steve Rogers never changed. Different timeline, different life, different scars, same core. And that is a much more powerful way to use a variant than simply giving him a different costume. The multiverse becomes a way to ask, what makes Steve Rogers Steve Rogers? Is it the serum? Is it the shield? Is it the uniform? Is it the memories? Or is it the person underneath all of those things? Because if you remove everything else and leave only the character, what remains? That question could become extremely important in Avengers Doomsday. Especially because Dr. Doom is the kind of villain who can force heroes to confront exactly what they believe they are fighting for. Doom doesn't just represent another physical threat. He represents control, order, a world shaped according to one person's vision. And against someone like that, Steve Rogers represents almost the opposite philosophy. Steve doesn't want to control the world. He wants people to have the freedom to choose. That's why putting multiple versions of Steve in the same story could actually serve the larger conflict. Each Steve could represent a different consequence of those choices. One chose a peaceful life, one chose endless duty, one might have lost everything. One might have gained everything, and yet all of them could still believe they're doing the right thing. That is where the story could become emotionally complicated. Imagine the peaceful Steve looking at the battle-hardened Steve. He sees a version of himself who never got the life he wanted, and the battle-hardened Steve looks back at him and sees something he never had: a family, a home, a life without war. Neither one is necessarily jealous. Neither one is necessarily wrong. They're just the result of different choices. And suddenly the multiverse isn't about infinite worlds anymore. It's about infinite possibilities of one human life. That concept fits Steve Rogers better than almost any other MCU character. Because we've always known Steve as someone who wonders what his life could have been. Back in the 1940s, he was the weak kid who wanted to serve but couldn't. Then he became the strongest man in the room. He lost Peggy. He lost his original world. He woke up in a future that didn't belong to him. He built a new family with the Avengers. Then he lost that too. And finally, he went back. So if Marvel gives us another Steve who never made that final choice, it wouldn't just be fan service. It would be a direct exploration of the character's biggest unresolved question. What if Steve Rogers had made a different choice? And that brings us back to the Cap versus Cap fight in Endgame. At the time, it was played mostly for comedy. The future Steve knows exactly what the younger Steve is going to do. The younger Steve doesn't know what he's looking at, and the whole thing works because it's ridiculous to see Captain America fighting himself. But now, after the multiverse saga, that scene feels different. Because Marvel has already shown us the basic idea. Two versions of Steve Rogers can occupy the same space. They can fight, they can interact, they can look at each other, and they can both believe they're the real Steve. The difference is that Endgame's two Steves were separated by time. Doomsday could potentially give us Steves separated by reality, and that's a much bigger problem. Because the younger Steve and older Steve are still fundamentally the same person. They share the same history, the same memories up to a certain point, the same origin. But an alternate Steve doesn't have to. His world could have taken a completely different path. Maybe Bucky died, maybe Peggy died earlier. Maybe the Avengers never formed. Maybe Steve never went into the ice. Maybe he woke up in a world where the super soldier program became something completely different. Maybe he never fought Thanos. Maybe he lost his universe to an incursion long before our Steve even knew the multiverse existed. We don't know, and that's precisely why the possibility is so exciting. Because Marvel doesn't need to reinvent Steve Rogers. They only need to ask one question: what if? And the MCU has already taught us that one tiny change can create an entirely different life. But there's another piece of evidence we can't ignore. The fact that Marvel is bringing Steve back specifically during the multiverse saga. If this were simply a nostalgic return, there were plenty of opportunities to do it earlier. Steve could have appeared in another Avengers project. He could have returned during Secret Invasion. He could have appeared through time travel. Instead, Marvel is bringing him back when the MCU is moving toward a collision of universes. That's significant. Because Avengers Doomsday isn't just another Avengers movie. The entire premise is connected to worlds colliding, characters from different realities crossing paths, and the MCU's larger multiversal crisis. So, Steve Rogers returning at exactly this point naturally raises a question. What version of Steve does this story actually need? Maybe it needs our Steve. Maybe it needs a variant. Maybe it needs both. And if it needs both, then the first teaser suddenly becomes even more interesting. Because that peaceful Steve may not be the warrior Marvel intends to use. He could be something even more important. He could be the emotional anchor, the Steve who reminds us what was lost, the Steve who represents the life that should have been. And then the long-haired Steve becomes the opposite. The version who walks into the war because he never had the luxury of walking away. That would make their eventual meeting incredibly powerful. Because imagine Steve Rogers looking at another version of himself and realizing, this is who I could have been. Or even worse, this is who I was supposed to become. That kind of moment would be far more meaningful than simply seeing two Captain Americas punch each other. And there is another question hiding underneath all of this. If there really are multiple Steves, which one is Marvel's main Steve? Which one is our Steve? The answer should be obvious. The Steve we followed from the first Avenger through Endgame. The Steve who eventually became the old man on the bench. But the multiverse doesn't care about our emotional attachment. To another universe, another Steve could be the original. Another Steve could be the one who lost everything. Another Steve could be the legendary Captain America. And another Steve could look at our Steve and say, you're the variant. That is the kind of reversal Marvel loves. Because suddenly, the character we've always called the main Steve isn't necessarily special because he's the only Steve. He's special because he's ours. And that distinction becomes even more important when we remember what Steve Rogers actually represents. He's not important because there is only one of him. He's important because no matter how many versions exist, we recognize the qualities that make him Steve. The courage, the loyalty, the refusal to abandon people, the instinct to stand between danger and everyone else. That's why an alternate Steve could still lift Mjolnir. That's why another Steve could still become Captain America. And that's why multiple Steves wouldn't necessarily diminish the character. If Marvel handles it correctly, they could actually make Steve Rogers more meaningful. Because for the first time, we could see the difference between the man and the choices that shaped him. And if Avengers Doomsday really intends to take us there, then the long-haired Steve isn't just another look. He may be the biggest clue yet that Marvel wants us to start thinking about Steve Rogers not as one fixed identity, but as a possibility. A possibility that can exist in more than one universe. A possibility that can take more than one path. A possibility that can lose, win, sacrifice, retire, fight, love, and still somehow remain Steve Rogers. And that leaves us with the most important question of all. If the peaceful Steve and the warrior Steve really are two different versions, which one is going to face Dr. Doom? Because that answer could tell us exactly what Marvel has planned for Steve's role in the next phase of the MCU. And there is one particular detail from the trailer that may give us the biggest clue yet. And that detail is Mjolnir, because Steve Rogers holding Mjolnir isn't just a visual we remember from Endgame. It's a visual that carries an enormous amount of history with it. The first time Steve lifted Mjolnir, the moment worked because it answered a question the MCU had been teasing for years. Was Steve Rogers worthy? After everything we'd seen him sacrifice, the answer was finally undeniable. But if Avengers Doomsday is giving us another Steve who can wield that same weapon, then the meaning changes. Because now we aren't asking whether Steve Rogers is worthy. We're asking whether every version of Steve Rogers is worthy, and those are two completely different questions. Imagine that the long-haired Steve really is from another reality. His universe may have been completely different from ours. His relationship with the Avengers may have been different. His history with Thor may have been different. Maybe he has never met our Avengers at all. And yet somehow, he can lift Mjolnir. That would tell us something very important. Whatever happened to that Steve, whatever universe he came from, whatever choices he made, the core of Steve Rogers survived. That's the fascinating thing about variants. You can change almost everything around a character without changing the fundamental qualities that make audiences recognize them. A different world can create a different Steve, but there may still be something inside him that makes him worthy, and Marvel has already played with this idea through other characters. We've seen variants who are almost unrecognizable from the versions we knew. We've seen characters who look completely different, behave differently, and have entirely different histories. But there is usually one common thread connecting them: the possibility of what that character can become. And Steve Rogers might be one of the clearest examples of that concept, because Steve was never defined by one particular uniform. He wasn't defined by the shield. He wasn't even defined by the super soldier serum. Those things made him powerful. They didn't make him Steve Rogers. Steve was already Steve before the serum. He was the guy who kept trying to enlist even when everyone told him no. He was the guy who stood up to bullies despite being physically weaker. He was the guy who volunteered for an experiment because he believed he could make a difference. The serum amplified his body. It didn't create his character. And that means a Steve Rogers variant can look different, live differently, and make different choices, while still possessing the same quality that makes him worthy. That could be exactly what Avengers Doomsday wants us to understand. But there's another possibility we haven't fully considered. What if the long-haired Steve isn't simply another Steve from another universe? What if he's the Steve who survived something our Steve never experienced? Because that's where the multiverse becomes dangerous. We tend to imagine alternate universes as places where everything is completely different, but they don't have to be. A universe could be almost identical to ours, until one single event changes everything. One person dies, one decision changes, one battle ends differently, one piece of technology falls into the wrong hands, one timeline branches, and suddenly, decades later, the Steve Rogers who came out of that reality could be completely different. Maybe our Steve got to retire because the Avengers won. Maybe another Steve never did. Maybe our Steve got Peggy. Maybe another Steve lost her. Maybe our Steve passed the shield to Sam. Maybe another Steve never found anyone capable of carrying it. Maybe our Steve became a father. Maybe another Steve spent his entire life fighting. And when those two finally meet, they wouldn't just be looking at another version of themselves. They'd be looking at the consequences of their lives. That's why the baby in the teaser may be more important than it appears. At first, it looks like a simple emotional image, Steve Rogers holding his child. But narratively, that image establishes something. It tells us that Steve has finally built a life that has nothing to do with Captain America. And that gives Marvel a very specific emotional position to place him in. Steve has something to lose. That matters, because the Steve who has nothing left can run into battle without hesitation. But the Steve who has a family, he has a reason to be afraid. And if doom threatens that family, then bringing Steve back into the fight becomes much more personal. He isn't fighting because the Avengers called. He isn't fighting because somebody handed him a shield. He's fighting because the world his family lives in is being destroyed. That would actually make his return completely consistent with who Steve has always been. Steve doesn't fight because he enjoys war. He fights because he hates what happens when good people are left unprotected. And now, for the first time, he has something deeply personal to protect. But if the long-haired Steve is a different version, then Marvel can create an even stronger contrast. One Steve has a family to protect, the other might have lost his, and both are fighting for the same reason. That's the kind of parallel that can make a multiverse story feel like an actual story instead of just a collection of cameos. Because the multiverse works best when the alternate versions aren't there simply because fans recognize them. They're there because their differences matter. And Steve Rogers gives Marvel an opportunity to do exactly that. Now let's go back to Endgame one more time. Because there's something almost poetic about the fact that Steve's story already contains a version of this mystery. At the end of the movie, Steve disappears into the past. Everyone assumes he's going to return, but he doesn't. Instead, the Avengers find an elderly man waiting for them. And that reveal works because the audience understands that something happened during the missing years. We don't see every moment. We don't know every detail. We simply see the result. Young Steve went back, old Steve appeared, and the MCU trusted us to understand the emotional journey between those 2 points. Now imagine Marvel doing something similar with Doomsday. We see one Steve in the teaser, we see another Steve in the trailer, and somewhere between those appearances, the movie explains that these aren't simply 2 different looks. They're 2 different points in a much larger story. The audience could spend the first half of the movie assuming one thing, and then discover that the truth is completely different. That would fit the way Marvel has handled Steve before, because Steve's biggest reveals have often come from recontextualizing something we thought we understood. The Winter Soldier reveals that Bucky survived. Civil War reveals the truth about Tony's parents. Endgame reveals that Steve isn't actually returning to the present. And now Doomsday could reveal that when Marvel said Steve Rogers was returning, they didn't necessarily mean the Steve Rogers we expected. That possibility is what makes the wording so interesting. Steve Rogers will return. The name is specific. Not Captain America, not the Avengers, Steve Rogers. And if multiple versions of Steve exist, Marvel could use that exact identity as the connecting thread. The audience sees Chris Evans. We immediately recognize him. But then, the story slowly asks us to look beyond the face. Who is this Steve? Where is he from? What happened in his universe? What does he remember? And perhaps most importantly, what does he want? Because that's where a variant becomes a character. If the long-haired Steve simply arrives, punches something, lifts Mjolnir, and disappears, then he's just spectacle. But if he arrives carrying an entire history we don't know, then suddenly every scar, every decision, and every difference matters. Maybe his long hair isn't just a design choice. Maybe it represents years of isolation. Maybe the beard tells us he hasn't lived the same controlled life as our Steve. Maybe the costume tells us he never stopped being a soldier. Maybe he comes from a universe where the Avengers lost. Maybe he has spent years trying to prevent the exact catastrophe that is now happening across realities. And maybe that's why he's already ready for doom. Because he's seen what happens when the multiverse starts collapsing. Our Steve hasn't. That could make the alternate Steve an incredibly valuable character. He could know things our heroes don't. He could understand the threat before anyone else. He could recognize doom before the Avengers realize what they're dealing with. And suddenly, his presence isn't about nostalgia anymore. He's a warning, a living example of what happens when the heroes fail. But then, imagine the emotional conflict if our Steve meets him. Because our Steve has spent his life believing that people can be saved. The alternate Steve might not believe that anymore. Maybe his universe taught him the opposite lesson. Maybe he fought for years and still lost everyone. Maybe he learned that sometimes you can't save everyone. And now you've got 2 Steve Rogers standing on opposite sides of the same philosophy. Our Steve says, we don't leave people behind. The other Steve says, sometimes you have to. That would be a real conflict between variants. Not good Steve versus evil Steve, but one Steve shaped by hope and another shaped by loss. And Dr. Doom could exploit that difference, because Doom doesn't necessarily need to defeat Steve physically. He could challenge what Steve believes. He could force him to choose between saving his family and saving another universe. He could create the exact situation Steve has spent his entire life trying to avoid. a choice where somebody has to lose. And that's where the Steve Rogers we know becomes incredibly important. Because his entire character has been built around refusing that kind of compromise, even when everyone else says there is no alternative, even when the odds are impossible, even when sacrificing himself seems like the easiest answer. Steve keeps looking for another way. That's why his confrontation with Doom could become more than a superhero battle. It could become a battle between two completely different philosophies. Doom believes the world needs someone powerful enough to control its future. Steve believes people deserve the freedom to choose their own. Doom wants certainty. Steve accepts sacrifice and uncertainty. Doom wants order at any cost. Steve wants freedom, even when freedom is messy. And if multiple Steve Rogers exist, then Marvel can show us exactly what happens when that philosophy is tested in different realities. One Steve might have broken, another might have survived, and our Steve might be the one who still refuses to give up. That could also explain why Marvel would bring Steve back now instead of simply keeping his story closed. Because the multiverse saga is ultimately about choices, different universes, different decisions, different consequences. And Steve Rogers is one of the MCU's most recognizable symbols of choice. He has always been the man who decides to do the right thing, even when doing the right thing costs him everything. So imagine the final battlefield of Avengers Doomsday. The universes are colliding. Heroes from different realities are fighting side by side. Thor is there. The Fantastic Four are there. The X-Men are there. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, there are two Steve Rogers. One has a family waiting somewhere. The other has nothing left to return to. One is fighting because he wants to protect the future. The other is fighting because he refuses to let another universe suffer the fate of his own. And for a moment, they look at each other. They don't need to explain who they are. They already know, because they're both Steve Rogers. And maybe that's when Marvel gives us the emotional payoff, not by asking which Steve is the real Captain America, but by showing that both of them are. Because Captain America was never about one man. It was always about the values that man represented. And that's exactly why Sam Wilson can carry the shield while Steve Rogers can return without taking it away from him. Sam doesn't have to become Steve. Steve doesn't have to replace Sam. They can both represent the same idea in completely different ways. And if there are multiple Steve Rogers, that idea becomes even stronger. Because the multiverse can change the person. But it doesn't have to change the principle. That's the real reason the number of Steve Rogers may not matter as much as we think. 1 Steve, 2 Steves, 10 Steves, 100 different versions scattered across infinite realities. The interesting question isn't how many faces Marvel can put on screen. It's whether every one of those faces still understands what Steve Rogers stood for. And that brings us back to the original question: how many Steve Rogers are actually in the MCU? The honest answer is, we don't know. Not yet. We know there is our main Steve. We know we've seen younger and older versions of him. We know we've seen Loki impersonate him. And we know Avengers Doomsday is bringing Steve Rogers back. But the exact relationship between the peaceful Steve holding the baby and the long-haired Steve standing with Mjolnir has not been officially explained. So we shouldn't treat the variant theory as confirmed. It is a possibility. A very interesting possibility. But still a possibility. And that distinction matters because the MCU has a very simple explanation available. The two images could simply show the same Steve at different moments. Steve has a family. Something happens. The multiverse crisis begins. He returns to the fight. Years pass. His appearance changes. He picks up Mjolnir again. That's entirely possible. And honestly, it might even be the more emotional story. Because then Marvel gets to show us something we almost never get to see with superheroes. A hero who already got his ending, being forced to leave that ending behind one more time. Steve fought for decades to finally have a normal life, and now the universe might be asking him to sacrifice it again. That would make his return tragic, because Steve would know exactly what he's giving up. He's not the young man who doesn't know what a peaceful life feels like. He's the old man who finally had it. And now he has to choose family or the world, peace or war, the life he wanted or the responsibility he never truly escaped. And perhaps that is the real reason Marvel showed us the baby first. Because before Steve becomes the warrior again, we need to see the man he became when the fighting finally stopped. We need to understand what he's risking. Otherwise, his return is just another superhero comeback. But if we see Steve Rogers as a father first, then watch him pick up Mjolnir again. The meaning changes completely. He's not returning because he wants to be Captain America. He's returning because something has threatened the life he built, and that is a much more powerful reason. Still, there is one final possibility that makes the entire mystery even more complicated. What if the two Steves aren't separated by years or even by universes? What if they're separated by the way Steve's Endgame time travel actually worked? Because Endgame left us with one of the biggest unanswered questions in Steve Rogers' story. When Steve went back in time, did he create a new timeline? Or did he somehow live quietly inside the same timeline we were already watching? The movie gives us the emotional answer, but not every technical detail, and that missing piece could become incredibly important in the multiverse saga. Because if Steve's journey created or existed within another branch, then the elderly Steve sitting on that bench may not have come from exactly the timeline we thought, and suddenly, the Steve holding the baby, the old Steve on the bench, and the long-haired Steve with Mjolnir could all be connected in a way that we haven't fully seen yet. That possibility takes us straight back to the biggest mystery of Endgame. What exactly happened to Steve after he disappeared? Because Marvel showed us where he ended up, but they never showed us everything that happened in between. And if Avengers Doomsday finally opens that door, then the answer to how many Steve Rogers exist may have been hiding in Endgame all along. Because when Steve Rogers disappeared into the past at the end of Endgame, we were never actually shown the journey. We were shown the beginning. We were shown the destination. But everything in between was left to our imagination. And that is exactly the kind of gap Marvel can return to years later. Steve takes the stones back. He says goodbye to Bucky. He disappears. And then, an old man is sitting on a bench. That's it. We don't see Steve meet Peggy. We don't see their wedding. We don't see their home. We don't see their children. We don't see what Steve did when the world moved forward around him. We don't see whether he ever picked up the shield again. We don't see whether he remained completely outside the Avengers, and we certainly don't see whether his journey somehow crossed paths with another reality. The MCU simply gives us the final image and lets us fill in the blanks. But now we're living in the multiverse saga, and suddenly those blanks don't feel quite as harmless as they once did. Because the moment you introduce branching timelines and alternate realities, every unanswered part of Steve's journey becomes a potential doorway. And there is one thing we need to be careful about. Endgame's time travel rules were never presented as a simple change the past and rewrite the future system. The movie specifically established that going into the past doesn't simply erase the timeline you came from. The Avengers were effectively dealing with branching realities. That means Steve's decision to remain in the past has always carried a strange implication. If he lived out his life in the past, then where exactly did he live? Was it within a branch? Was it the same reality through a mechanism the movie deliberately left unexplained? Did he somehow return to the original timeline only after living his entire life? The MCU has never given us every detail, and that uncertainty is important. Because the safest conclusion is still that old Steve is the same Steve Rogers we've always known. But the existence of branching timelines means Marvel has room to explore the consequences of that journey without necessarily breaking what Endgame showed us. And that gives us a fascinating way to look at the two Doomsday Steves. Maybe the family Steve is exactly the Steve we know, the Steve who went back, the Steve who found Peggy, the Steve who grew old, the Steve whose story ended on that bench, and maybe the warrior Steve comes from somewhere else entirely. Not because our Steve failed, but because somewhere in the infinite possibilities of the multiverse, another Steve made a different choice. That's what makes the theory so much stronger than simply saying Chris Evans has a different hairstyle. Hair is not evidence. A beard is not evidence. A different costume is not evidence. Even Mjolnir isn't evidence that we're looking at a variant. Those are clues at best. The real question is whether the story requires two Steves, and right now, we don't know. But Marvel has created a situation where it absolutely could, and there is another detail that makes the possibility especially interesting. The Steve holding the baby isn't being presented as a superhero first, he's being presented as a human being. That distinction matters because Steve Rogers' entire journey has always been about the conflict between the person and the symbol. Before the serum, he wanted to be useful. After the serum, everyone wanted him to be a symbol. Captain America became bigger than Steve Rogers. The Shield became bigger than Steve Rogers. Eventually, even Steve himself struggled with what that identity meant, but at the end of Endgame, he finally separated the two. He gave Sam the shield, and by doing that, he essentially said, Captain America can continue without me. That was the point. Steve Rogers didn't need to remain Captain America forever for Captain America to survive. Sam Wilson could carry that legacy forward. So if Doomsday brings Steve back and immediately turns him into Captain America again, it risks undoing that message. But if Marvel instead brings back Steve Rogers, the man, then his return can exist alongside Sam Wilson. That's an important distinction. Sam doesn't have to lose the shield. Steve doesn't have to reclaim it. There can be two heroes carrying the same legacy in completely different ways, and if the long-haired Steve is a variant, that makes the distinction even cleaner. The main Steve can remain the man who chose family. The alternate Steve can be the warrior who still carries the identity of Captain America. And Mjolnir can belong to that warrior without taking anything away from Sam. In fact, that could create one of the most interesting conversations in the entire movie. Imagine Sam meeting an alternate Steve Rogers. Not the Steve who handed him the shield, a different Steve, a Steve who doesn't know Sam. A Steve who never experienced the events that led to their friendship, and Sam has to explain that in his universe. Steve Rogers trusted him enough to carry the shield. That could be incredibly emotional, because this alternate Steve would be meeting the future he never got. He would be meeting a version of himself who finally found peace, and Sam would be meeting a Steve who never became the man he remembers. Suddenly, one conversation could tell us everything about the multiverse without needing a giant exposition scene. Different worlds, different choices, same person. And then there's Bucky. Because if Marvel really wants to explore multiple Steve Rogers, Bucky becomes one of the most emotionally powerful characters to place beside them. Our Steve's relationship with Bucky is one of the defining relationships of the MCU. Bucky is the person who knew Steve before Captain America, before the serum, before the shield, before the Avengers. He knew Steve Rogers, not the symbol, not the legend, the person. So imagine Bucky meeting another Steve, a Steve who never lost him, or a Steve who lost him permanently, or a Steve who doesn't even recognize him. That could make the multiverse concept feel personal instead of mechanical, because the audience wouldn't just be seeing different versions of characters. We would be seeing different versions of relationships, different lives, different losses, different chances, and Steve Rogers is the perfect character to make that emotional. Because his entire story has been built around people he couldn't save and people he refused to abandon. That brings us back to Dr. Doom. Because if Doom is the force bringing these realities into collision, then he doesn't necessarily need to create the differences between the Steves. He only needs to exploit them. Imagine Doom looking at the peaceful Steve and saying, in effect, that he chose a life of comfort while other worlds burned. Imagine the alternate Steve looking at our Steve and believing he was lucky. Imagine both of them realizing that neither version had the complete story. That's the kind of conflict that could make Doom feel genuinely dangerous. Not because he can beat Steve in a fight, but because he can challenge the beliefs that Steve built his entire life around. And there's a beautiful irony here. Steve Rogers spent his life believing that every life mattered, but the multiverse creates a horrifying problem. What happens when saving one universe means sacrificing another? What happens when there are billions of innocent people on both sides? What happens when there is no perfect answer? That's the kind of situation where Steve's values are tested harder than ever. And if there are multiple versions of him, Marvel can show us different answers. One Steve might choose his family, another might choose the larger universe, another might refuse to choose, and perhaps our Steve is the one who finds another way. Because that's always been Steve. When everyone else says the situation is impossible, Steve asks what they haven't tried yet. That's why his return could matter so much. Not because the MCU needs another strong fighter. There are plenty of those now. Not because the Avengers need another person who can hold a shield. They already have Captain America. Steve Rogers matters because of what he represents, and that brings us to the biggest misunderstanding about this entire theory. The question isn't really, how many Steve Rogers are there? The better question is, how many different ways can Steve Rogers exist? Because once you think about it that way, the answer becomes almost limitless. There is the Steve who was frozen in ice. The Steve who became an Avenger, the Steve who fought Iron Man, the Steve who lifted Mjolnir, the Steve who returned the stones, the Steve who chose Peggy, the old Steve on the bench, the Steve holding a baby, and potentially the Steve with the beard and long hair. Some of these are the same man. Some may be different versions, and one of them wasn't Steve at all. It was Loki. That's the important part. The MCU doesn't have to give us 10 completely separate Steve Rogers to make the idea of multiple Steves meaningful. It only needs to show us 2 genuine versions who made different choices, because 2 would be enough. 2 Steves could tell an entire story. One shows us the life Steve wanted. The other shows us the life he might have had, and standing between those 2 possibilities is the same question Steve has faced since the beginning. What are you willing to sacrifice? That's why the baby matters. That's why Mjolnir matters. That's why the beard matters. Not because any one of those details proves a variant, but because together they create a contrast. Family and war, peace and duty, old life and new battle. Steve Rogers, the man, and Steve Rogers, the symbol. And if Marvel is deliberately building that contrast, then Avengers Doomsday could be doing something much smarter than simply bringing back a fan-favorite character. It could be asking us to reconsider what Steve Rogers actually means. For years, we thought Captain America was the shield. Then Steve gave the shield away, and the world didn't end, because the idea survived. Sam Wilson became Captain America. Steve Rogers became something else. A man. A father, a husband, someone who had finally earned the right to stop fighting. But if the multiverse forces him back into the story, Marvel has one final opportunity. Not to make Steve Captain America again, but to show us why Steve Rogers was always more important than the title. And maybe that's why the wording of his return matters. Steve Rogers will return, not necessarily the Captain. Not necessarily the Avenger. Steve Rogers, the man. And if there really are 2 Steves in Doomsday, then the most powerful moment might not be a fight between them at all. It might be something much quieter. One Steve looking at the other, seeing his own face, seeing his own life, seeing everything that could have been different, and realizing that somewhere in another universe, another version of him made another choice. Maybe they don't fight. Maybe they don't argue. Maybe they simply understand each other, because nobody could understand Steve Rogers better than Steve Rogers. And that's where the theory finally comes full circle. At the beginning, we asked, how many Steve Rogers are there? 1, 2, 3? But after looking at everything the MCU has already established, the answer is actually more precise. There is one main Steve Rogers whose story we followed. There are multiple versions of that same Steve across different points in time. There are characters who can impersonate him. And because the multiverse exists, there can also be alternate Steve Rogers variants. But Avengers Doomsday has not yet officially confirmed how many genuine Steve Rogers variants we're actually going to see. So we shouldn't say there are definitely two. We shouldn't say the long-haired Steve is definitely from another universe. And we shouldn't say the family Steve and Warrior Steve are definitely different people. The movie has to answer that. But the possibility is now impossible to ignore, because Marvel has already built the rules. Endgame showed us Steve meeting Steve. The multiverse saga established that variants can exist, and Doomsday is bringing Steve Rogers back at exactly the moment when different realities are beginning to collide. So if Marvel wants to use multiple Steves, they absolutely can. And if they don't, the mystery still works. Because then, the story becomes about one Steve Rogers being forced to make one final sacrifice. The man who finally got his peaceful life being asked to leave it. And that may actually be the more heartbreaking possibility. Because imagine the moment Steve realizes that the universe is falling apart. He looks at his family. He knows what he's about to do. He knows that if he goes back into the fight, he may not come home. But this time, Steve isn't sacrificing himself because he doesn't know what he's losing. He knows exactly what he's losing. He has finally experienced the life he spent his entire existence dreaming about, and he still chooses to protect everyone else. That's Steve Rogers. And if the long-haired Steve is a variant, the meaning changes. If he's the same Steve, the meaning changes. Either way, the character works. Because Steve Rogers was never defined by whether he had the shield. He was defined by what he did when the shield wasn't enough. And perhaps that's the final answer to the entire mystery. Maybe there aren't dozens of Steve Rogers hiding across the MCU. Maybe there's only one Steve Rogers we truly care about. And every other version, every younger face, every older face, every possible variant exists to show us just how many different ways that one man could have lived. That's the beauty of the multiverse. It doesn't just show us different worlds, it shows us different possibilities. And Steve Rogers may be the perfect character to represent that idea, because after everything we've seen, the question isn't really whether Marvel can bring Steve Rogers back. They already have. The real question is, which Steve Rogers are we getting? The Steve who chose Peggy, the Steve who chose the Avengers, the Steve who chose family, the Steve who chose the battlefield, or perhaps all of them. And if Avengers Doomsday really puts multiple Steve Rogers on the same battlefield, then that old Cap versus Cap scene from Endgame may suddenly look very different. Because maybe Marvel wasn't just showing us a funny time travel paradox. Maybe it was showing us the simplest version of a much bigger idea. A Steve can meet another Steve. A hero can meet another version of himself. And when that happens, the most important question isn't which one is real. They're both real. The question is, which one will choose to stand when everything else falls apart? And if there's one thing we've learned about Steve Rogers after all these years, it's that no matter the universe, no matter the timeline, no matter how old he is, and no matter what version of himself he's facing, Steve Rogers will always find a way to stand. So maybe the answer was never one. Maybe it was never two. Maybe it was never three. Maybe the MCU doesn't have multiple Steve Rogers because Marvel wants to confuse us. Maybe it has multiple Steve Rogers because after everything the character has been through, the story finally wants to show us that Steve Rogers was never just one man. He was an idea, and ideas don't disappear. They return. They evolve. They find someone new to carry them. Sometimes that's Sam Wilson. Sometimes it's another Steve. And sometimes it's the same Steve Rogers who thought he had finally put the shield down until the universe gave him one more reason to pick it up. And that is why the next time you see that long-haired Steve Rogers standing beside Thor, don't just ask yourself whether it's the same man from the farmhouse. Ask something much more important. What happened to him? What did he lose? What did he choose? And if he really is another Steve, what happened in his universe to turn him into the man standing there? Because the answer to those questions could tell us far more about Avengers Doomsday than the number of Steves ever could. And maybe, when the movie finally reveals the truth, we'll realize that the biggest mystery was never how many Steve Rogers there are. It was understanding which version of Steve Rogers Marvel needed to bring back. And after everything we've seen, there may be only one answer, the one who still chooses to stand. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, share it with another Marvel fan, and subscribe to MovieCast for more MCU theories and breakdowns. And if you want to directly support the channel, you can also send a $25 super thanks. It genuinely helps MovieCast keep making videos like this.